The firefighter's radio crackled with static as he rounded the burning cabin, expecting to find another casualty. Instead, he froze mid-step, his helmet slipping from numb fingers and clattering against the ash-covered ground. A 400-pound black bear was lifting a massive wooden beam off a trapped man, its powerful muscles straining against the weight that would have crushed any hope of rescue. The same bear everyone called a killer was saving a life. "Jesus Christ," whispered his partner, dropping the medical kit as the bear gently nudged the unconscious veteran away from the flames. The radio burst with frantic voices demanding updates, but neither man could speak. Dorothy Anderson pressed her weathered hands against the ambulance window, tears streaming down her face as she watched her neighbor being pulled from certain death. 6 months ago, the whole town had demanded this bear be put down. "Get that footage to every station," the fire chief barked into his phone, his voice shaking. "The world needs to see this." Who saves whom when the flames come calling? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Marcus Thompson sat on his cabin's sagging porch, counting the pills in his prescription bottle for the third time that morning. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly before him, beautiful and indifferent, much like the world had become since he'd returned from Afghanistan. His left leg throbbed where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone, but the real wounds ran deeper than any surgeon could reach. At 35, Mac carried himself like a man twice his age. 3 tours as a Marine canine handler had left him with a purple heart he kept buried in a drawer, a limp that worsened in cold weather, and a hypervigilance that made grocery stores feel like minefields. The disability checks barely covered rent and medications, forcing him to take odd jobs, fixing engines and mending fences for neighbors who whispered about the broken veteran living alone in the woods. His closest companion was Dorothy Anderson, a 72-year-old widow who lived a quarter-mile down the gravel road. Dot had lost 3 husbands to wars and cancer, raised 7 children mostly alone, and somehow still found reasons to believe in second chances. She brought Mac homemade soup every Sunday and stayed for coffee, pretending not to notice when his hands shook or when sudden noises made him dive for cover. "You remind me of my late husband Earl," she'd told him once, stirring sugar into her cup with deliberate slowness. "Came back from Vietnam carrying invisible weights. Took him years to set them down, but he did it. You will too, honey." Mac's days followed rigid patterns designed to keep chaos at bay. Morning coffee at sunrise, exactly 1 cup. Check the perimeter of his property, noting any changes since yesterday. Feed the chickens, repair whatever the wind had damaged overnight, avoid the mailbox when it contained bills he couldn't pay. Evenings belonged to silence and the amber glow of whiskey that made sleep possible. The cabin itself reflected its owner's state of mind. Built in the 1940s by a homesteader with more hope than skill, it tilted slightly eastward and groaned in strong winds. Mac had patched what he could afford to fix and learned to live with the rest. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily, marking time like a metronome. Newspapers yellowed on the coffee table next to empty beer bottles and overdue notices from creditors. Outside, the chicken coop leaned against a fence that had seen better decades. Mac's ancient pickup truck, a 1995 Ford with more rust than paint, sat beside a pile of scrap metal he'd been meaning to haul to the recycling center for months. The nearest neighbor, aside from Dorothy, lived 3 miles away, exactly how Mac preferred it. This isolation suited him perfectly until the morning Deputy Ryan Clark called with news that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude. Ryan, his old high school friend who'd somehow avoided both war and its consequences, spoke with the careful tone people used when delivering life-changing news. "Mac, you need to hear this. There's a situation at the wildlife sanctuary and they need someone exactly like you." The call came on a Tuesday morning when the Montana sky hung low and gray, threatening snow that wouldn't arrive for another month. Mac had been staring at his bank statement, the numbers swimming together like accusations, when his phone rang with Ryan's familiar voice cutting through the silence. "There's a bear at Wild Haven Sanctuary," Ryan said without preamble. 4 years old, black bear, male. They're calling him Bruno, though God knows why. He's scheduled for euthanization in 72 hours. Mac set down his coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the wooden table. "What's that got to do with me?" "Everything." Ryan's voice carried the weight of old friendship and professional necessity. "This bear was illegally kept by the Harrison family for 3 years. Robert Harrison, you know him, owns half the timber operations in the county. When Fish and Wildlife finally seized the animal, they thought they could rehabilitate him, release him back to the wild." The name Harrison rang bells Mac wished would stay silent. Robert Harrison had made headlines years ago when his 8-year-old son Michael died in what newspapers called a tragic camping accident. The details had been sparse, but rumors flew through small towns like wildfire. "Bear attack," they whispered. "Father's negligence. Family destroyed." "Let me guess," Mac said, already knowing where this conversation was heading. "The rehabilitation didn't take." 3 sanctuary workers injured in the past month. Bruno won't eat properly, won't respond to their protocols. He's too humanized, they say. Too damaged. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, she runs the place. She's at her wit's end. The board of directors voted yesterday. If they can't find him a permanent home in the next 3 days, they're putting him down. Mac walked to his window, looking out at the vast expanse of forest that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. "Ryan, I can barely take care of myself. I'm broke. I'm broken. And I sure as hell don't know anything about raising bears." "That's exactly why you're perfect for this." Ryan's voice softened. "Mac, you've seen what Dr. Mitchell hasn't figured out yet. You know what it's like to be written off, to have everyone assume you're too far gone to save. This bear, he's not aggressive because he's evil. He's scared, man. He's been abused, abandoned, and now everyone's given up on him." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Mac could hear Dorothy's words echoing from their last Sunday dinner. "Sometimes the thing that needs saving the most is the thing that ends up saving you." "Where is he now?" Mac asked. 2 hours later, Mac's rusted pickup truck coughed its way into the parking lot of Wild Haven Sanctuary. The facility sprawled across 40 acres of reclaimed farmland, a maze of enclosures, veterinary buildings, and administrative offices that smelled of disinfectant and hope. Dorothy had insisted on coming along, settling herself in the passenger seat with the determination of a woman who'd outlived 3 husbands and wasn't about to miss whatever happened next. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell met them at the entrance, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her green eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that comes from caring too much for too long. At 42, she carried herself with the competent grace of someone who'd built her life around healing creatures that couldn't thank her in words. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending a hand that was stronger than it looked. "Ryan told me about your military background." "I have to be honest with you. We've tried everything. Bruno responds to no one, trusts nothing. He's destroying equipment, refusing enrichment activities, and yesterday he charged the fence when a volunteer got too close." They walked along a gravel path between enclosures housing raccoons, foxes, and a one-winged hawk that watched them pass with intelligent amber eyes. The September air carried the scent of pine needles and animal musk, a wild perfume that made Mac's chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "Here he is," Dr. Mitchell said, stopping before a reinforced steel enclosure that looked more like a prison than a home. Bruno sat in the far corner, a mountain of black fur and muscle that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At 4 years old and 360 pounds, he was smaller than the grizzlies that occasionally wandered through these mountains, but his presence filled the space with coiled tension. His left ear bore a jagged scar, and his eyes held the hollow look Mac recognized from his own mirror. The bear's head lifted as they approached, and for a moment Mac felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. There was intelligence there, and pain, and something else that made Mac's breath catch in his throat. Recognition. This wasn't the mindless aggression of a wild animal defending territory. This was the desperate rage of a creature that had learned the world was a place where trust got you hurt. "How long do I have to decide?" Mac asked, though he already knew his answer. The decision crystallized in Mac's mind like frost forming on glass, inevitable and irreversible. He stood watching Bruno pace the perimeter of his steel prison, each massive paw hitting the ground with deliberate force, and saw himself in that restless movement. The bear's rhythm matched the cadence of Mac's own sleepless nights, when memories of Afghanistan played on endless loop and peace seemed like a foreign concept. "I'll take him," Mac said quietly. Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to understand what you're committing to. Bruno requires specialized food that costs $400 monthly. He needs veterinary care from someone experienced with exotic animals. The liability insurance alone—" "I said I'll take him." Mac's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made harder decisions under fire. "What do I need to sign?" Dorothy placed a weathered hand on Mac's arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "Honey, are you sure about this?" "Your savings are $3,200, Mac finished. "Enough for the adoption fee, enclosure materials, and maybe 2 months of food if I'm careful." He turned to Dr. Mitchell. "Draw up the papers." The next hour passed in a blur of legal documents, liability waivers, and warnings that Mac absorbed with the same stoic acceptance he'd once applied to mission briefings. Each form he signed felt like a small rebellion against the voice in his head that whispered he was too broken to care for anything, let alone a traumatized bear weighing more than a motorcycle. As they finalized the paperwork, a commotion erupted in the parking lot. A black Mercedes SUV with Harrison Lumber Company logos emblazoned on the doors pulled up with the aggressive confidence of money demanding attention. Robert Harrison stepped out, his expensive boots crunching on gravel, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the wind. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and checkbooks. "Where is he?" Harrison demanded, striding past Mac and Dorothy as if they were furniture. "Where's my bear?" Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, placing herself between Harrison and the enclosure. "Mr. Harrison, Bruno is no longer your property. Fish and Wildlife seized him 6 months ago, and he's been legally adopted by Mr. Thompson here." Harrison's gaze swiveled to Mac, taking in the faded jeans, the second-hand jacket, the military bearing that couldn't be purchased or intimidated. "You?" Harrison laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You think you can handle an animal that I spent $50,000 training? That bear cost me a barn, 2 tractors, and 3 trips to the emergency room. He's dangerous." "Funny," Mac said, his voice level. "From where I'm standing, you're the one who sounds dangerous." The two men faced each other across 10 feet of gravel and 20 years of different choices. Harrison radiated the kind of barely controlled fury that comes from losing something you never deserved to own. Mac stood with the quiet stillness of someone who'd faced real enemies and wasn't impressed by playground bullies with expensive lawyers. "I'm filing an injunction," Harrison snarled. "That bear belongs to me. I raised him, I trained him, and I'm not letting some broken-down veteran destroy 3 years of work." Dorothy stepped forward, all 5 feet of her bristling with grandmother's indignation. Robert Harrison, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. That poor creature looks half-starved and twice traumatized. If this is your idea of care, I'd hate to see your neglect." Harrison's face reddened, but before he could respond, a low rumble emerged from Bruno's enclosure. The bear had approached the fence nearest to them, his massive frame pressed against the steel mesh, dark eyes fixed on Harrison with unmistakable recognition. The sound he made wasn't quite a growl, but it carried enough menace to make everyone step back except Mac. "He remembers you," Mac observed. "Question is, are those good memories or bad ones?" Harrison's confident facade cracked slightly. "Bruno and I have a complicated relationship. He needs structure, discipline, things a bleeding heart like you wouldn't understand." "I understand plenty about discipline," Mac replied. "I also understand the difference between training and torture. Which category did your methods fall into, Mr. Harrison?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Dr. Mitchell cleared her throat diplomatically. "Gentlemen, the adoption is legal and final. Mr. Harrison, if you have concerns about public safety, you're welcome to file them with the county commissioners. Mr. Thompson, you'll need to transport Bruno today before 6 p.m. to meet the terms of the agreement." Harrison pulled out his phone with the sharp efficiency of a man calling in artillery strikes. "My lawyers will have something to say about this. That bear is a public menace, and putting him in the hands of someone with PTSD is asking for a tragedy." The words hit Mac like physical blows, each syllable designed to wound. The parking lot fell silent except for the wind rustling through pine needles and the distant sound of other animals settling into their afternoon routines. Mac felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the rising panic that came when the world felt too much like a battlefield. Then Bruno made another sound, softer this time, almost questioning. Mac looked toward the enclosure and found the bear watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. There was something in that gaze that Mac recognized, a kind of weary hope that maybe, finally, someone would understand. "My PTSD," Mac said quietly, "taught me to recognize real threats. And right now, Mr. Harrison, you're looking like the biggest danger in this parking lot." Harrison climbed back into his Mercedes with the stiff dignity of a man retreating to fight another day. As he drove away, Dorothy squeezed Mac's arm. "That man's carrying more poison than a rattlesnake," she murmured. "But honey, are you sure you're ready for this fight? Because that bear's just the beginning of your troubles." Mac watched Bruno settling back into the shadows of his enclosure, and for the first time in months felt something other than emptiness in his chest. Purpose, maybe, or just the recognition that some battles were worth fighting, even when you weren't sure you could win. The trailer ride home passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of Bruno's massive body hitting the reinforced walls. Mac gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, each impact sending vibrations through the truck's frame and straight into his already frayed nerves. Dorothy sat beside him, one hand pressed against the dashboard, the other clutching her purse like a lifeline. "He's scared," she said, when a particularly violent crash made the whole vehicle shudder. "Poor thing doesn't understand where he's going." Mac caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "Makes two of us." The drive to Mac's property took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads that seemed to grow narrower with each mile. When they finally pulled into the clearing where Mac's cabin sat like a weathered monument to solitude, Bruno had gone ominously quiet. Mac had spent the previous night hastily constructing what he hoped would pass for a secure enclosure using salvaged fence posts, heavy-gauge wire mesh, and every dollar of his rapidly dwindling savings. Unloading Bruno proved to be an exercise in controlled chaos. The bear emerged from the trailer like a force of nature, his bulk flowing past Mac with surprising grace before he immediately began testing every inch of his new prison. Mac watched from outside the fence as Bruno systematically examined each post, each joint, each potential weakness, with the methodical thoroughness of an escape artist planning his next performance. The first night set the tone for what would become a grueling test of wills. Mac slept on his porch, wrapped in an old sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of systematic destruction emanating from the enclosure. By dawn, Bruno had reduced Mac's carefully constructed chicken coop to kindling and somehow managed to bend 3 fence posts despite their steel reinforcement. "Well," Dorothy said when she arrived with coffee and surveyed the damage, "at least he's got energy." The complaints began within hours. Margaret Stevens, a 65-year-old grandmother who lived 2 miles down the road, called the county sheriff's office 3 times before noon. Her grandchildren visited every summer, she explained in increasingly shrill phone calls, and she wouldn't have them terrorized by some lunatic veteran's pet monster. The sheriff, a patient man named Tom Bradley, who'd known Mac since high school, drove out personally to assess the situation. "Mac, I've got to ask," Sheriff Bradley said, standing safely outside the enclosure while Bruno watched them from the far corner. "What exactly is your plan here? Because right now it looks like you've adopted a very large, very expensive problem." Mac had been asking himself the same question. His bank account, already anemic, was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Bruno's specialized diet cost more per week than Mac typically spent on groceries in a month. The veterinary bills from Dr. Mitchell's required health checks were stacking up like unpaid parking tickets. And now he needed to rebuild half his property to bear-proof specifications. "He just needs time," Mac said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The breakthrough came during Mac's second week of sleeping on the porch. He'd been reading aloud from an old paperback novel, partly to calm his own nerves and partly because Dr. Mitchell had mentioned that Bruno responded to human voices. Most nights the bear ignored him completely, but this particular evening Mac noticed that Bruno had moved closer to the fence while he read. When Mac paused to turn the page, Bruno made a sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that conveyed a surprisingly complex emotion. It reminded Mac of the sounds Rex used to make when he was trying to communicate something important but lacked the words. "You want me to keep reading?" Mac asked. Bruno's response was to settle into a more comfortable position, his massive head resting on his paws, dark eyes fixed on Mac's face with an attention that was almost human in its intensity. That night, Mac read for 3 hours straight, his voice growing hoarse as he worked through chapters about cowboys and cattle drives and men finding redemption in the vast emptiness of the American West. Bruno listened to every word, occasionally shifting position, but never breaking eye contact. When Mac finally closed the book, the bear released a long, rumbling sigh that sounded remarkably like contentment. The next morning brought both progress and new problems. Mac woke to find that Bruno had arranged his food into neat piles instead of scattering it around the enclosure, a sign that Dr. Mitchell assured him indicated reduced stress. However, he also discovered that Robert Harrison had made good on his legal threats. A process server arrived before Mac had finished his first cup of coffee, delivering papers that made his head spin with legal terminology and court dates. Harrison was seeking an emergency injunction to reclaim Bruno, citing public safety concerns and claiming that Mac's adoption violated several county ordinances about exotic animal ownership. The legal fees alone would cost more than Mac earned in 6 months, even if he could find a lawyer willing to take the case. "You need help," Dorothy announced that afternoon, settling into Mac's kitchen with the determination of a general planning a campaign. "And I know just where to get it." The veterans of foreign wars post in town had been struggling for membership as older members passed away and younger veterans chose different ways to process their service. When Dorothy marched into their weekly meeting and explained Mac's situation, she found an audience more receptive than she'd dared hope. "This is exactly the kind of fight we're built for," declared Frank Morrison, a grizzled Vietnam veteran who'd been running the post for 15 years. "Rich man trying to steamroll a brother who's just trying to heal. Hell, we've seen this movie before." Within days, Mac found himself at the center of a grassroots campaign that surprised him with its intensity. Frank organized a legal defense fund that raised $3,000 in its first week. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between a struggling veteran and a wealthy businessman who'd never served his country. The social media reactions split along predictable lines. Save Bruno began trending regionally, with supporters sharing stories of their own rescue animals and combat veterans posting about the healing power of caring for damaged creatures. The opposition countered with #public safety, sharing statistics about exotic animal attacks and questioning the wisdom of allowing someone with PTSD to own a potentially dangerous predator. Mac tried to ignore the online commentary, but it was impossible to escape entirely. Strangers drove slowly past his property, some honking in support, others stopping to take photos they could share with captions about government overreach or liberal bleeding hearts. The attention made his skin crawl, but he endured it because the alternative was losing Bruno. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. Mac spent the preceding days working with a volunteer lawyer from the Veterans Group, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in disability rights and had strong opinions about Harrison's motivations. "This isn't really about the bear," she explained during one of their preparation sessions. "Harrison lost his son in a terrible accident, and he's been looking for someone to blame ever since. Bruno represents his failure to protect his family, and you represent everything he thinks he should have been: military service, sacrifice, honor. He can't stand that you succeeded where he failed." The morning of the hearing, Mac woke before dawn to find Bruno pressed against the fence closest to the house, as if the bear sensed the approaching crisis. Mac walked over to the enclosure, and for the first time since bringing Bruno home, the bear approached the fence voluntarily. "I don't know what's going to happen today," Mac said quietly. "But I want you to know that adopting you was the first thing I've done since coming home that felt right. Whatever happens, that's not changing." Bruno reached through the mesh with one massive paw, stopping just short of touching Mac's hand. It was an offer of contact, tentative and careful, but unmistakable in its intention. Mac extended his own hand until their fingers nearly met, separated only by a few inches of wire and the weight of everything they'd both survived. The courthouse in town bustled with more activity than it had seen in months. Harrison arrived with 2 lawyers and a briefcase full of documents purporting to show that Bruno was dangerous and Mac was unfit for exotic animal ownership. Mac arrived with Jennifer Walsh, Frank Morrison, and Dorothy, who'd dressed in her best church outfit and brought a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The hearing itself lasted 3 hours and felt like 3 years. Harrison's lawyers presented evidence of Bruno's past aggression, Mac's PTSD diagnosis, and county ordinances that supposedly prohibited keeping bears in residential areas. They painted a picture of inevitable tragedy, of a damaged man with a dangerous animal living in a powder keg of potential violence. Jennifer Walsh countered with testimony from Dr. Mitchell about Bruno's improving behavior, statements from Mac's neighbors about his responsible pet ownership, and documentation of the legal adoption process. She argued that Harrison's real motivation was not public safety, but personal revenge, and that stripping Bruno from Mac would constitute cruel and unusual punishment for both of them. When Judge Patricia Hoffman finally called for a recess to consider her decision, Mac felt like he'd been holding his breath for hours. He walked outside to find a crowd of supporters gathered on the courthouse steps, many of them veterans he'd never met but who understood the stakes of this fight in ways that transcended words. "Whatever she decides," Frank Morrison said, clapping Mac on the shoulder, "you fought the good fight. Sometimes that has to be enough." But as Mac looked up at the courthouse windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that losing Bruno would be like losing Rex all over again. Another failure to protect something innocent that depended on him. The thought made his chest tight and his hands shake, familiar symptoms of a panic that never quite went away. Dorothy took his arm and guided him to a bench where they could sit in relative quiet. "That bear chose you just as much as you chose him," she said. "Whatever happens in there, that's not changing. Love doesn't get canceled by paperwork, honey." Judge Hoffman's gavel fell with the finality of a coffin nail, but her words brought unexpected reprieve. Mac could keep Bruno, she ruled, provided he met stringent conditions: monthly veterinary inspections, upgraded security measures, and liability insurance that would cost him nearly as much as his mortgage. It was a Pyrrhic victory that left Mac financially devastated but legally vindicated. Harrison stormed from the courtroom without looking back, his expensive shoes clicking against marble floors like the countdown to revenge. His parting words to the assembled press were venomous. "When that animal hurts someone, remember who allowed this travesty to continue." The months that followed tested every assumption Mac had made about healing, both his own and Bruno's. Winter arrived early and harsh, blanketing the Montana mountains in snow that made everything quieter and more isolated. Mac's heating bills doubled as he struggled to keep Bruno's enclosure warm enough for a creature that should have been hibernating in a den of his own making. The bear's behavior began to shift in subtle ways that Dr. Mitchell documented during her monthly visits. Bruno no longer destroyed everything within reach, instead focusing his considerable intelligence on solving puzzles Mac created from PVC pipes and hidden treats. He responded to his name consistently and had learned to sit on command, though he did so with the dignity of a creature humoring a well-meaning but limited human. More importantly, Bruno had begun to trust. When Mac sat reading in the evenings, the bear would press against the fence closest to the porch, close enough that Mac could see the individual whiskers around his muzzle and the way his ears twitched at every sound. Sometimes, when Mac's PTSD flared and nightmares made sleep impossible, he would find Bruno awake and watching, as if the bear could sense distress from 50 yards away. The financial strain, however, was becoming unbearable. Mac's disability checks covered basic survival, but Bruno's needs consumed everything else. The specialized diet, veterinary care, facility improvements, and insurance premiums created a monthly deficit that grew larger each week. Mac began selling possessions: his grandfather's watch, his television, tools he'd inherited from his father, but it was like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon. Dorothy watched Mac grow thinner and more desperate with each passing week. His pride prevented him from accepting direct charity, but she found creative ways to help, bringing enough casserole for leftovers that would feed him for days, accidentally buying too many groceries and needing Mac to take the surplus, hiring him for odd jobs around her property that needed doing anyway. The town's attitude toward Mac and Bruno evolved slowly, like ice melting in spring. Margaret Stevens, the grandmother who'd led the initial opposition, experienced a change of heart after witnessing Bruno's gentle response to her visiting grandchildren. The bear had approached the fence when the children appeared, moving with careful deliberation to avoid startling them, and had sat patiently while they peppered him with questions and observations. "He's bigger than our house," 5-year-old Emma had exclaimed, and Bruno had tilted his massive head as if considering whether this was accurate. "He's not scary," her 7-year-old brother Jake had declared with the confidence of youth. "He looks sad, like when our dog Duke got old." Margaret found herself visiting Mac's property more frequently, ostensibly to check on community safety, but increasingly drawn by genuine curiosity about the relationship developing between man and bear. She began bringing small gifts: apples for Bruno, coffee for Mac, stories about her late husband who'd also struggled with what they'd called war nerves back then. The breakthrough came on a February morning when Mac woke to find his property invaded by reporters and camera crews. Someone had leaked footage of Bruno playing with a ball Mac had given him, footage that showed the bear's remarkable gentleness as he carefully moved the toy around his enclosure without destroying it. The video had gone viral overnight, shared across social media platforms with captions about rehabilitation, second chances, and the healing power of love. Mac's phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, and invitations to appear on talk shows. He turned them all down until Dorothy pointed out the obvious. "Honey, this attention could solve your money problems. Maybe it's time to let the world see what we see." The first interview, with a regional morning show, nearly ended in disaster when Mac's PTSD was triggered by the camera lights and he had to excuse himself for several minutes to regain composure. But when he returned and spoke honestly about his struggles with mental health, about finding purpose in caring for another damaged soul, the response was overwhelming. Donations began pouring in from across the country. Veterans organizations sent checks with notes about understanding the healing power of purpose. Animal lovers contributed to Bruno's care fund. Children sent drawings of bears and handwritten letters asking about Bruno's favorite foods and whether he missed living in the forest. The success brought new challenges. Harrison, apparently watching Mac's growing prominence with increasing fury, began a campaign of legal harassment. He filed noise complaints, challenged Mac's zoning permits, and hired private investigators to document any violation of the court's conditions. The pressure was constant and exhausting, like being under siege in his own home. Then came the night that changed everything. Mac woke to the sound of sirens and the smell of smoke, his combat-trained reflexes pulling him from sleep before his conscious mind processed the danger. Through his bedroom window, he could see an orange glow reflecting off the low-hanging clouds, too close and too bright to be anything but fire. The drought had lasted 6 months, turning the Montana forest into a tinderbox waiting for ignition. A lightning strike 20 miles away had sparked a wildfire that was now racing through the mountains with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. The wind was driving it directly toward Mac's property and the surrounding residential area. Sheriff Bradley's voice crackled over a bullhorn. "Mandatory evacuation. All residents must leave immediately. You have 30 minutes to clear the area." Mac's neighbors were already loading trucks and cars with whatever they could save. Dorothy appeared at his door, her ancient Buick packed with photo albums and her late husband's medals, her face pale with worry. "Mac, we have to go now. The radio says the fire could be here in an hour." But Mac stood frozen, looking toward Bruno's enclosure where the bear was pacing frantically, his sensitive nose detecting the approaching danger long before human senses registered the threat. Every instinct screamed at Mac to grab his truck keys and flee, to save himself while he still could. But looking at Bruno, trapped in a cage of Mac's making, unable to follow his natural instincts to escape to higher ground, Mac felt something snap inside his chest. "I can't leave him," Mac said quietly. Dorothy grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Honey, they'll evacuate him too. The authorities—" "Won't risk their lives for a bear," Mac finished. "You know that. Everyone will save themselves and leave Bruno to burn." The evacuation convoy was already moving down the mountain road, a stream of headlights disappearing into the smoke-hazed distance. Mac could see the fire now, a wall of orange and red climbing the far ridge like something alive and hungry. The wind was shifting, pushing waves of superheated air ahead of the flames, making the very atmosphere feel combustible. Mac made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier, when he'd been nothing more than a broken veteran hiding from the world. He sent Dorothy away with promises he wasn't sure he could keep, then turned back toward the enclosure where Bruno waited, dark eyes reflecting the growing firelight. "Just you and me now, big guy," Mac said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's see if we're as smart as we think we are." The fire reached Mac's property line as he was trying to coax Bruno into the transport trailer, but the bear refused to enter the confined space that reminded him too much of his years of captivity. The temperature was rising rapidly, and Mac could hear the approaching roar of flames consuming the forest with unstoppable hunger. That's when the wind shifted again, driving a wall of superheated air and flying embers directly toward them. And Mac realized with crystalline clarity that they were about to die together. Two damaged souls who'd found each other too late to save themselves. The fire struck Mac's property like the wrath of an angry god, transforming his carefully maintained sanctuary into a hellscape of smoke and flame. The ancient pines that had stood sentinel over his cabin for decades became towering torches, their resin-heavy needles exploding in cascades of sparks that danced through the superheated air like malevolent fireflies. Mac abandoned the trailer and ran toward the cabin to grab the bolt cutters, his only hope of freeing Bruno before the flames reached them. The smoke was so thick now that breathing felt like drowning in reverse, each inhalation searing his lungs with toxic heat. Behind him, he could hear Bruno's distressed vocalizations, a sound that cut through the fire's roar like a blade through flesh. The cabin's roof was already smoking when Mac burst through the front door. He had maybe 2 minutes before the structure became fully engulfed, 2 minutes to find the tools that might save Bruno's life. His hands shook as he rifled through the garage, precious seconds ticking away while the fire closed in like the jaws of some primordial beast. When he emerged with the bolt cutters, a burning tree had fallen across the path to Bruno's enclosure. Mac vaulted over the smoldering trunk, feeling the heat through his jeans as he landed hard on the other side. The metal fence around Bruno's enclosure was already too hot to touch safely, but Mac gripped the bolt cutters anyway, the handles burning his palms as he worked to cut through the heavy-gauge wire. Bruno watched him work, no longer pacing but standing perfectly still in the center of his enclosure. There was something almost supernatural about the bear's calmness in the face of approaching death, as if he understood that panic would only make their situation worse. When Mac finally cut through enough wire to create an opening, Bruno emerged with the dignity of a prisoner walking to freedom. For a moment, they stood together in the clearing between Mac's burning cabin and the wall of fire advancing through the forest. Mac's truck was too close to the cabin, already beginning to smolder from the radiant heat. The road was blocked by fallen trees and abandoned vehicles. Every escape route Mac could think of was either blocked or would lead them directly into the fire's path. That's when Bruno did something that defied every assumption Mac had made about their relationship. Instead of running toward the mountains where his instincts should have led him, the bear moved closer to Mac, pressing his massive shoulder against the man's leg in what could only be described as comfort. It was as if Bruno understood that they were partners now, that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The wind shifted again, driving a wall of flame toward them with horrifying speed. Mac felt the hair on his arms begin to singe, and knew they had seconds rather than minutes before the fire consumed everything. He started running toward the only place that might offer shelter, the old storm cellar his grandfather had dug behind the cabin during the Cold War, a concrete bunker that had seemed like paranoid overkill until this moment. Bruno followed without hesitation, his massive frame moving with surprising grace across the smoke-shrouded ground. They reached the cellar just as a burning pine tree crashed down where they'd been standing moments before. Mac yanked open the heavy steel door and dove inside, Bruno tumbling after him into the cool darkness below ground. The cellar was cramped, barely large enough for Mac to stand upright, and with Bruno's bulk filling most of the available space, it felt like being trapped in a coffin. But it was concrete and steel, built to withstand nuclear fallout, and it might just protect them from the fire raging overhead. Mac pulled the door shut, and they huddled together in absolute darkness, listening to the apocalyptic sounds of his world burning above them. The fire passed over them like a living thing, its roar so loud that Mac felt it in his bones rather than heard it with his ears. The cellar's steel door grew hot enough to glow faintly in the darkness, and the temperature inside rose until Mac's clothes were soaked with sweat. Bruno panted heavily beside him, his fur radiating heat like a furnace, but the bear remained calm, occasionally rumbling in what Mac had learned to recognize as reassurance. They stayed underground for 3 hours, long past the point where Mac's claustrophobia should have driven him to panic. In the military, he'd hated confined spaces, had requested assignments that kept him in open country where he could see threats coming. But with Bruno's solid presence beside him, breathing steadily in the darkness, Mac found a peace he hadn't experienced since before the war. When they finally emerged, Mac's property was unrecognizable. The cabin had been reduced to a smoking foundation and a blackened chimney that stood like a gravestone marking what his life had been. The trees were gone. The grass was gone. Even the fence posts around Bruno's former enclosure had been reduced to twisted metal sculptures. Everything Mac owned, everything that had defined his existence for the past 2 years had been erased in the span of an afternoon, but as devastating as the physical destruction was, it paled compared to what Mac discovered when he tried to call for help. His cell phone had no signal, the landlines were down, and the main road was blocked by debris and abandoned vehicles. They were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a moonscape of ash and destruction with no way to signal for rescue. Bruno seemed to understand their predicament before Mac did. The bear began moving purposefully through the burned landscape, pausing occasionally to sniff the air and test the ground with his massive paws. Mac followed, partly because he had no better plan, and partly because Bruno's confidence suggested the bear knew something Mac didn't. They walked for hours through the devastated forest, Bruno leading them along paths that only he could detect. The bear avoided areas where the ground was still smoldering and steered them away from unstable trees that might fall without warning. It was as if Bruno possessed some innate knowledge of fire behavior that civilization had bred out of humans. As night fell, they reached a small creek that had somehow survived the fire, its water black with ash but still flowing. Mac knelt beside the stream and cupped the bitter water in his hands, drinking deeply despite its metallic taste. Bruno waded into the creek and lay down, steam rising from his overheated fur as the cool water provided relief from the day's ordeal. It was there, sitting beside the creek under a sky still orange with reflected firelight, that Mac experienced a moment of clarity that cut through his exhaustion like lightning through storm clouds. Everything he'd thought he needed, his cabin, his possessions, his carefully constructed isolation, had been taken away in a matter of hours. Yet sitting beside Bruno in the ruins of his former life, Mac felt more complete than he had since returning from Afghanistan. The bear had saved his life by leading him to shelter, had guided him to safety through a landscape of destruction, had chosen to stay with him when every instinct should have driven Bruno back to the wild. For the first time since adopting the bear, Mac understood that their relationship wasn't about him rescuing a damaged animal. It was about two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. As the night deepened and the fire's glow faded to mere ember light on the horizon, Mac leaned against Bruno's warm bulk and finally allowed himself to believe that somehow, against all odds, they were going to survive this together. Rescue came at dawn in the form of a National Guard helicopter whose crew nearly refused to believe what they were seeing through their binoculars. A man and a massive black bear sat together beside a creek in the middle of a burned wasteland, neither showing any signs of aggression toward the other. The pilot circled twice before attempting to land, convinced that the smoke was playing tricks with his vision. "Sir, step away from the animal!" the crew chief shouted over the rotor wash as the helicopter touched down 50 yards away. "We're here to extract you!" Mac raised his hand in acknowledgement but made no move to leave Bruno's side. The bear had lifted his head at the mechanical noise, but seemed more curious than alarmed by the arrival of their rescuers. After spending the night pressed against Bruno's warm fur, listening to the steady rhythm of the bear's breathing, Mac found the helicopter's presence almost intrusive. "The bear comes with me," Mac called back, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. The crew chief, a veteran himself who recognized the look of a man pushed past his breaking point, made a decision that would later earn him both commendations and reprimands. "Load them both," he told his team. "We'll sort it out on the ground." The flight to the evacuation center took 20 minutes, but news of their rescue traveled faster than the helicopter. By the time they landed at the emergency staging area, a crowd of reporters, officials, and curiosity seekers had gathered to witness the arrival of the veteran and his bear. Video footage of Mac and Bruno exiting the helicopter together, both covered in ash and moving with the careful coordination of survivors, would be playing on news channels within the hour. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was waiting with a mobile veterinary unit, her face tight with worry until she saw Bruno walking beside Mac under his own power. She'd driven through roadblocks and around fallen trees to reach the evacuation center, certain that she would be examining a badly burned animal, or worse, confirming a death. "How is this possible?" she asked Mac as she began her preliminary examination of Bruno. "The fire reached temperatures over 1,000 degrees. Nothing should have survived in that area." Mac told her about the storm cellar, about Bruno's uncanny ability to navigate through the burned landscape, about the night they'd spent by the creek while the forest continued to smolder around them. As he spoke, Dr. Mitchell documented Bruno's condition with growing amazement. Aside from mild smoke inhalation and some singed fur on his feet, the bear was remarkably unharmed. "It's like he knew exactly what to do," Mac concluded, "like he'd been preparing for this his whole life." The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. The story of the veteran and his bear surviving a wildfire together struck something deep in the public consciousness, tapping into primal narratives about loyalty, survival, and the bonds that transcend species. Within hours, #BrunoSaves became the top trending hashtag on social media, accompanied by photos and videos of their rescue that had been shared millions of times. But it was what happened next that truly revealed the depth of their connection and set in motion events that would change everything. 3 days after the fire, while Mac was staying in a Red Cross shelter and Bruno was being cared for at the sanctuary, Mac suffered a severe PTSD episode triggered by the stress of losing everything he owned. He became catatonic, unresponsive to medical personnel, and seemingly unreachable behind walls of trauma and shock. Dr. Mitchell made a decision that violated every protocol in her professional handbook. She loaded Bruno into a transport trailer and brought him to the shelter, convinced that the bear's presence might be the only thing that could reach Mac in his dissociative state. The shelter staff initially refused to allow a bear inside, but when local veterans threatened to remove Mac from their care, administrators reluctantly agreed to the unprecedented therapy session. Bruno's response to seeing Mac in distress was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive bear approached the cot where Mac lay staring at nothing, moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of his size. He settled on the floor beside the bed and began making soft vocalizations, sounds that Dr. Mitchell had never heard from him before, almost like a mother bear calling to her cubs. Slowly, over the course of several hours, Mac began to respond. His eyes focused first on Bruno's face, then his hand moved to rest on the bear's massive head. When Mac finally spoke, his first words were an apology. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry I couldn't save your home." Bruno's response was to press closer to Mac, offering the comfort of his presence in the way that only creatures who've shared trauma can understand. It was a moment of such profound connection that even the skeptical shelter staff found themselves wiping away tears. The reunion sparked a new wave of media coverage, but this time the focus shifted from the sensational story of survival to the deeper questions about healing, trauma, and the relationships that make recovery possible. Psychologists and animal behaviorists weighed in on the unusual bond between Mac and Bruno, with many noting that both man and bear showed classic signs of post-traumatic stress and seemed to find healing in their shared experience. It was during this period of intense public scrutiny that the first crack appeared in Robert Harrison's carefully constructed narrative. A local reporter, digging into the background of the story, discovered inconsistencies in Harrison's account of his son's death 5 years earlier. The official report mentioned a bear attack, but witness statements suggested a more complex sequence of events. Eleanor Harrison, Robert's 78-year-old mother, had been carrying the weight of the truth for 5 years. Watching the news coverage of Mac and Bruno's survival, seeing the genuine love between man and bear, finally gave her the courage to speak. She contacted the reporter and agreed to an interview that would shatter her son's version of events. "Michael wasn't attacked by a bear," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with 5 years of suppressed guilt. "He was saved by one. Bruno's mother fought off another bear that had cornered my grandson. If it hadn't been for that bear family, Michael would have died that day in the woods instead of 3 days later in the hospital." The revelation hit Robert Harrison like a physical blow. For 5 years, he had built his identity around being the victim of a senseless tragedy, the father who had lost his son to nature's cruelty. Learning that the bears he'd spent years hating had actually tried to save Michael's life destroyed the foundation of his entire worldview. The truth about Michael's death was even more devastating. The boy had suffered internal injuries during his fall into a ravine while running from the aggressive bear. Bruno's mother had driven off the threat and stayed with Michael until hunters arrived, but in the chaos and trauma of the rescue, no one had realized the extent of the child's injuries. By the time they got him to the hospital, internal bleeding had progressed too far for surgery to save him. Robert Harrison had been so consumed with grief and the need to blame someone that he'd convinced himself the bears were responsible for his son's death rather than accepting the random cruelty of accident and timing. He'd spent 5 years tormenting Bruno, the offspring of the very bears who had tried to save Michael's life. The weight of this revelation broke something fundamental in Harrison. He disappeared from his home and business for 3 days, driving aimlessly through the mountains where his son had died, trying to reconcile 5 years of misdirected hatred with the truth of what had actually happened. When he finally returned, he was a changed man, hollow-eyed and broken by the magnitude of his mistake. His first stop was the Red Cross shelter where Mac was staying. Harrison found him sitting outside with Bruno, both of them looking out at the mountains where they'd nearly died together. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other, years of conflict and misunderstanding hanging between them like smoke. "I was wrong," Harrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About Bruno, about you, about what happened to my son. I've spent 5 years hating the wrong things for the wrong reasons." Mac studied Harrison's face, seeing something he'd never noticed before, a grief so profound it had twisted into something unrecognizable, a love for his son that had become poisoned by the need for someone to blame. It was a pain Mac understood intimately, having carried his own guilt about Rex's death for years. "Grief makes us do terrible things sometimes," Mac said quietly. The question is, what we do when we finally see clearly. Harrison's answer would determine not just Bruno's future, but the possibility of healing for everyone whose lives had been damaged by 5 years of misplaced anger and the search for someone to blame for life's random cruelties. Robert Harrison's redemption began with a single phone call to his team of lawyers, instructing them to withdraw all legal actions against Mac and Bruno immediately. But it was his second call that truly demonstrated the depth of his transformation. He contacted the Red Cross and offered to personally fund the reconstruction of Mac's property, not as an act of charity, but as a small step toward making amends for 5 years of misplaced vengeance. "I can't bring back those years," Harrison told Mac during their second meeting, this time with Bruno resting peacefully between them. "But I can make sure you and Bruno have a proper home. It's what Michael would have wanted. He always loved animals more than people." The revelation about Michael's true story had rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. Eleanor Harrison's interview had been picked up by national news outlets, transforming the narrative from a simple survival story into something deeper, a meditation on grief, forgiveness, and the ways trauma can distort our understanding of truth. Margaret Stevens, the grandmother who had initially opposed Bruno's presence in their community, became one of his most vocal advocates. She organized a neighborhood committee to support Mac's recovery, coordinating everything from temporary housing to donated clothing to replace what he'd lost in the fire. Her transformation from opponent to ally reflected the broader shift in public opinion as people began to understand the complex web of pain and misunderstanding that had nearly destroyed 2 innocent beings. "I was scared," Margaret admitted during a community meeting, "scared of what I didn't understand. But watching that man and his bear survive together, seeing the love between them, that's not something to fear. That's something to protect." The rebuilding of Mac's property became a community effort that drew volunteers from across the state. Veterans organizations sent work crews, animal welfare groups provided funding for Bruno's new enclosure, and local businesses donated materials and labor. What emerged from the ashes was not just a new home, but a symbol of what was possible when people chose healing over hatred. Bruno's new enclosure was a masterpiece of thoughtful design, spanning 2 acres of natural habitat with streams, trees, and caves that allowed him to express natural behaviors while maintaining the security required by law. More importantly, it included a small cabin where Mac could stay during Bruno's adjustment periods, recognizing that their bond was now an integral part of both their healing processes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell documented Bruno's remarkable recovery as they settled into their new home. The bear, who had once been aggressive and unpredictable, was now calm, confident, and surprisingly social. He responded to Mac's voice commands, tolerated the presence of visitors, and showed none of the destructive behaviors that had characterized his time with the Harrison family. "It's unprecedented," Dr. Mitchell told the team of animal behaviorists who had come to study their relationship. "Bruno has essentially trained himself to be a therapy animal. He responds to Mac's emotional state, provides comfort during PTSD episodes, and has even learned to alert others when Mac needs medical attention." The transformation was mutual. Mac's nightmares decreased in frequency and intensity. His hypervigilance softened into a more manageable awareness. And for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he began to talk about the future with something approaching hope. He started sleeping through the night, stopped jumping at unexpected sounds, and began to trust that the world might have more kindness in it than cruelty. Dorothy Anderson, now in her 73rd year, took to calling herself Bruno's grandmother with the fierce pride of someone who had witnessed a miracle unfold in her own backyard. She instituted Sunday dinners that became legendary in their community. Elaborate affairs where Mac, Bruno, Dr. Mitchell, and an ever-growing circle of friends gathered to share food, stories, and the kind of companionship that heals wounds no medicine can touch. "You boys gave me a reason to keep going," she told Mac one evening as they watched Bruno play with a ball in his enclosure. "After Earl died, I thought I was done with love, done with caring about anything. But watching you two find each other reminded me that family comes in all shapes and sizes." The surprise came 6 months after the fire during one of Dr. Mitchell's routine examinations. Bruno had been acting strangely, more protective of Mac, more territorial around the enclosure, and displaying behaviors that seemed maternal in nature. The ultrasound revealed what no one had suspected. Bruno was female, and she was pregnant. The discovery reframed everything they thought they knew about Bruno's behavior and biology. Her protective instincts, her intelligence, her remarkable ability to read human emotions, all of it took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of maternal psychology. She wasn't just a traumatized bear learning to trust again. She was a mother-to-be preparing to create the kind of safe, loving environment she had never experienced herself. Mac's reaction to the news was a mixture of awe and terror. Caring for Bruno was challenge enough. The prospect of baby bears seemed overwhelming. But as he watched Bruno, he still thought of her by that name, and it seemed to suit her regardless of gender. Preparing her den with the meticulous care of an expectant mother, he realized that this wasn't a complication, it was completion. "She's going to teach them everything we've learned together," Mac told Dr. Mitchell as they watched Bruno arrange branches and leaves in her sleeping area. "How to trust, how to love, how to see humans as partners instead of threats. She's breaking the cycle." The cubs were born on a warm spring morning, 2 perfect miniatures of their mother, with Bruno's intelligent eyes and gentle temperament. Mac was the first human they saw, the first voice they heard besides their mother's rumbling comfort. From their earliest moments, they associated human presence with safety and care. Harrison visited a week after the births, bringing his elderly mother Eleanor to meet the family that had inadvertently saved them all from years of misdirected grief. Eleanor wept when she saw the cubs nursing, remembering her own grandson's love for baby animals and the joy he would have felt at this sight. "Michael would have named them," Eleanor said, her voice thick with tears that were equal parts sorrow and joy. "He had names for every creature he met, called them his forest friends. So they named the cubs Michael and Hope, honoring both the boy whose death had started this chain of pain and the future that promised healing for everyone involved. Harrison established a trust fund for their care, ensuring that Mac would never again face the financial pressure that had once threatened to separate him from Bruno. The first time the cubs met children from the local elementary school, magic happened. Bruno, who had once been labeled too dangerous for human contact, carefully supervised as her babies played gently with kids who saw them not as wild predators, but as fellow young creatures deserving of love and respect. The children learned about wildlife conservation, about the importance of respecting animal habitats, and about the possibility of coexistence between humans and nature. Mac found himself becoming an accidental educator, speaking at schools and veterans groups about the healing power of caring for other living beings. His story, once a tale of individual survival, had become something larger, a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of forgiveness, and the truth that love could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. On the first anniversary of the fire, the community gathered at Mac's property for a celebration that honored both survival and rebirth. Bruno lay in the shade with her cubs, watching the humans who had become her extended family share food and laughter. Mac stood with Sarah Mitchell, their relationship having deepened into something that promised its own form of healing and hope. Robert Harrison spoke briefly to the gathering, his words simple but profound. "A year ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like. I thought it meant punishment, revenge, making someone pay for pain I couldn't accept. I was wrong. Justice looks like this, like forgiveness, like second chances, like love growing in places where hatred used to live." As the sun set over the mountains that had nearly claimed them all, Mac sat beside Bruno's enclosure with his hand resting against the fence. The bear pressed her massive paw against his palm through the mesh, their daily ritual of connection and trust. The cubs tumbled nearby, secure in a world where humans meant safety and love rather than fear and pain. Dorothy Anderson, now the self-appointed family historian, captured the moment with her old camera. Later, she would frame the photograph and hang it in her kitchen next to pictures of all her other grandchildren, biological and chosen, human and otherwise, all equally precious in the arithmetic of love. Sometimes the family we need most finds us when we least expect it, wrapped in fur and carrying wounds that mirror our own. Mac Thompson thought his story ended in a war-torn desert, but it really began beside a bear named Bruno, who understood that healing happens one gentle moment at a time. Like so many of us who've reached our golden years, Mac discovered that the love we give to broken things often comes back to save us when we need it most. Dorothy Anderson, at 72, reminded us that it's never too late to believe in miracles again, to open our hearts to unexpected families, and to find purpose in nurturing what others have given up on. Their story proves that second chances aren't just for the young, they're for anyone brave enough to see past the scars to the soul underneath. In a world that often tells us our best days are behind us, Mac and Bruno show us that sometimes our most meaningful chapters begin when we choose love over fear, hope over bitterness, and connection over isolation. The greatest adventures of our lives might still be waiting for us to say yes. What unexpected friendship has brought the most healing to your life? Have you ever found family in the most surprising places?